In June 1953, John and Mary Smith packed their belongings and left Cleveland for their new home in Oakwood Heights, a newly developed suburb just outside Detroit, Michigan. The neighborhood was a perfect example of post-war American suburbia. Rows of identical houses with manicured lawns, wide streets, and a sense of prosperity and optimism. Their new home at 1542 Maple Street was a modest two-story house with a small front yard and a detached garage. It represented a significant upgrade from their Cleveland apartment, and Mary initially felt excited about the prospect of decorating and making the space their own. The Smiths quickly fell into a new routine. John's new position as a senior engineer at the Detroit auto manufacturing company DMC meant longer hours and more responsibilities. He often left for work before dawn and returned late in the evening. Mary, meanwhile, took on the role of the perfect suburban housewife, keeping the house immaculate, preparing meals, and attempting to integrate into the neighborhood's social scene. In the first few weeks, Mary made efforts to meet her neighbors. She joined the local women's club and volunteered for community events. However, she found it challenging to form close friendships. The other women in the neighborhood seemed guarded, and there was an undercurrent of tension that Mary couldn't quite understand. One of the neighbors, Barbara Wilson from across the street, was particularly standoffish. Whenever Mary tried to engage her in conversation, Barbara would make excuses and hurry away. Mary noticed that Barbara often watched their house from behind her curtains, a worried expression on her face. As weeks turned into months, Mary began to notice peculiarities in John's behavior. His mood became increasingly erratic. Some days he would return home jovial and bearing gifts, while on others he was irritable and withdrawn. He began to spend more time in the basement, which he had converted into a workshop. He insisted that Mary never enter this space, claiming that his work projects were confidential. John also became more controlling of Mary's activities. He discouraged her from making friends in the neighborhood and grew angry when she mentioned wanting to find a part-time job. He insisted on knowing her whereabouts at all times and often called home multiple times during the day to check on her. Strange incidents began to occur in Oakwood Heights. In August, a young woman who lived 3 blocks away disappeared without a trace. The police conducted a thorough search, but no clues were found. The community was shaken, and a curfew was implemented. In September, another woman vanished. This time it was Barbara Wilson's sister, who had been visiting from out of town. The disappearance occurred on a night when John had worked particularly late. Mary remembered him coming home past midnight, looking disheveled and agitated. As fear gripped the community, Mary noticed John's behavior becoming even more erratic. He began to have hushed phone conversations that he would abruptly end when she entered the room. She found scraps of paper with strange notes and numbers, which John would snatch away and destroy if he caught her looking at them. One evening in early October, while John was working late, Mary decided to investigate the basement workshop. Using a spare key she had secretly made, she entered the forbidden space. What she found there would change her life forever. The basement was meticulously organized, with various tools neatly arranged on pegboards. But what caught Mary's attention was a locked cabinet in the corner. With trembling hands, she managed to pry it open. Inside, she found a collection of items that made her blood run cold. Women's jewelry, driver's licenses, and most disturbingly, a series of notebooks filled with detailed accounts of stalking and violence. As Mary flipped through the pages, the horrible truth began to dawn on her. The women mentioned in the notebooks were the same ones who had disappeared from Oakwood Heights and neighboring communities over the past few months. The level of detail in the accounts left no doubt. Her husband, John Smith, was responsible for these disappearances. Overwhelmed with shock and fear, Mary barely heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. John was home early. In a panic, she quickly replaced everything in the cabinet, rushed upstairs, and pretended to be asleep when John entered their bedroom. That night, as she lay awake next to the man she now knew to be a monster, Mary realized she was trapped in a nightmare. She would have to find a way to expose John's crimes while ensuring her own safety. The idyllic suburban life she had imagined had become a facade for something truly horrifying. Following her chilling discovery in the basement, Mary Smith found herself in a state of constant anxiety and fear. She struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy around John, painfully aware that any change in her behavior could potentially alert him to her knowledge of his crimes. In the days that followed, Mary began to pay closer attention to John's routines and behaviors. carefully documenting her observations in a small notebook she kept hidden in a hollowed-out book. She noted his work schedules, the times he left and returned home, and any unusual activities or absences. One of the first red flags Mary noticed was John's inexplicable absences during the night. On several occasions, she woke up to find his side of the bed empty. When confronted, John would claim he had trouble sleeping and had gone for a drive to clear his head. These nocturnal excursions often coincided with reports of strange noises or disturbances in the neighborhood. Mary also began to take note of John's clothing. She observed that he sometimes returned home with mud on his shoes or small tears in his clothes that hadn't been there when he left for work. Once, she found a shirt with what appeared to be bloodstains hidden at the bottom of the laundry basket. When she casually mentioned it, John became agitated and insisted on doing his own laundry from that point on. Another unsettling pattern emerged in John's interactions with the neighbors. He showed an unusual interest in single women, or those whose husbands were often away. He would engage them in conversation at community events, asking probing questions about their routines and schedules. Mary noticed how these women often seemed uncomfortable around John, as if sensing something predatory beneath his polite exterior. The basement workshop remained a source of great concern for Mary. She noticed that John spent increasing amounts of time there, often late into the night. The sounds of power tools and hammering would echo through the house, and John would emerge looking tired but strangely satisfied. Mary tried to casually inquire about his projects, but John remained evasive, insisting that his work was confidential. As weeks passed, Mary's suspicions were further fueled by John's reactions to news reports about the missing women. Whenever these stories came on the television or radio, John would become visibly tense. He would either quickly change the channel or leave the room altogether. On one occasion, when a reporter mentioned new evidence in one of the cases, Mary saw a flicker of what looked like panic cross John's face before he composed himself. Mary also noticed changes in John's mood and behavior that seemed to correlate with the disappearances. In the days leading up to a woman's vanishing, John would become increasingly agitated and short-tempered. However, immediately after a disappearance, he would be unusually calm and even cheerful, often surprising Mary with gifts or suggesting they go out for dinner. The financial aspect of their life also raised questions. Despite John's good job, Mary realized she had little knowledge of their exact financial situation. She discovered that John had a separate bank account she knew nothing about, and he was vague when she asked about their savings and expenses. This secrecy extended to his work life as well. John never invited colleagues home and was reluctant to attend company events with Mary. As Halloween approached, the atmosphere in Oakwood Heights grew increasingly tense. The disappearances had put everyone on edge, and there was talk of canceling trick-or-treating for the children's safety. John, surprisingly, argued strongly in favor of maintaining the Halloween traditions, insisting that the community shouldn't let fear control their lives. During this time, Mary's isolation intensified. John had gradually discouraged her from maintaining close friendships, and she found herself with few confidants. The one person she felt she could potentially trust was Officer Tom Reynolds, a young police officer who had recently moved to the area and seemed genuinely concerned about the community's safety. One afternoon while John was at work, Mary gathered her courage and approached Officer Reynolds as he was patrolling the neighborhood. She hinted at her suspicions without directly accusing John, asking hypothetical questions about evidence and reporting procedures. The officer seemed intrigued and slightly concerned by her questions, advising her to come to the station if she had any concrete information. As October drew to a close, Mary's notebook had grown thick with observations and suspicions. She knew she needed to find hard evidence to confirm her fears and bring John to justice. But she also realized the dangerous position she was in. If John discovered that she knew his secret, her life would be in immediate danger. Mary decided she needed to dig deeper, to find irrefutable proof of John's crimes. She began to formulate a plan to investigate more thoroughly, all while maintaining her role as the unsuspecting, devoted wife. Little did she know that her actions had not gone entirely unnoticed, and that John was growing increasingly suspicious of her behavior. The stage was set for a dangerous game of cat and mouse within the seemingly peaceful confines of their suburban home. As November began, Mary Smith intensified her efforts to uncover evidence of John's crimes. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but the weight of her knowledge and the fear for potential future victims drove her forward. Mary's first step was to create opportunities to investigate without arousing John's suspicion. She began volunteering for various community organizations, which gave her a plausible reason to be out of the house more often. She used these times to discreetly gather information about the missing women, talking to their friends and families under the guise of organizing community support. During one such conversation with the sister of Barbara Wilson, the neighbor who had disappeared, Mary learned that Barbara had been planning to move away from Oakwood Heights just before she vanished. This information struck Mary as significant, and she wondered if John had somehow learned of Barbara's plans and acted to prevent her from leaving. Mary also started keeping a detailed log of John's movements, noting the times he left for and returned from work, as well as any unexplained absences. She noticed a pattern. John often worked late on Thursdays, claiming he had to attend management meetings. However, when Mary casually mentioned these meetings to one of John's co-workers at a chance encounter in the grocery store, the man seemed confused, saying that their department didn't have regular Thursday meetings. Determined to find out what John was really doing on these Thursday nights, Mary decided to follow him. On a cold November evening, she told John she was attending a women's club meeting. Instead, she borrowed a neighbor's car and waited down the street from John's workplace. As expected, John left the office at his usual time but didn't head home. Mary cautiously followed him to a seedy part of town, where she observed him entering a rundown bar. After about an hour, John emerged from the bar with a woman Mary had never seen before. They got into John's car and drove to an isolated area near the outskirts of town. Mary's heart raced as she parked at a safe distance, watching John and the woman enter an abandoned warehouse. 30 minutes later, John came out alone, looking disheveled and agitated. Shaken by what she had witnessed, Mary rushed home before John could return. Her mind raced with the implications of what she had seen. Was this woman John's latest victim? Had she just witnessed a murder? The weight of her knowledge became almost unbearable. The next day, Mary scoured the local newspapers and listened intently to the radio, expecting to hear news of another disappearance. To her surprise and confusion, no such report came. This led her to consider a terrifying possibility. What if there were victims that had never been reported missing? Driven by this new theory, Mary began to research missing persons cases from neighboring towns and even other states. She spent hours at the local library, poring over newspapers and public records. Her efforts revealed a disturbing pattern. There were indeed several unsolved disappearances of women in areas where John had traveled for work over the past few years. As she delved deeper into her investigation, Mary became increasingly paranoid about leaving any traces of her activities. She started using the public library for her research instead of the home telephone line, and she buried her notebook of observations in the backyard rather than hiding it in the house. Mary also began to pay more attention to the basement workshop. She noticed that after some of John's late-night sessions in the basement, he would make trips to various locations around town in the early hours of the morning. She suspected he might be disposing of evidence, but she had no way to confirm her fears without risking discovery. One day, while John was at work, Mary finally gathered the courage to conduct a thorough search of the basement. She discovered a hidden compartment behind a false panel in the workshop. Inside, she found a box containing dozens of small personal items, jewelry, hair clips, and even a few driver's licenses. With trembling hands, she matched some of these items to descriptions of possessions belonging to the missing women. As she was carefully replacing everything, ensuring not to leave any signs of her search, Mary heard a car pulling into the driveway. John was home early. In a panic, she quickly closed the hidden compartment and rushed upstairs, her heart pounding. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Mary noticed John watching her intently. "You seem preoccupied lately, dear," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Is everything all right?" Mary forced a smile, feeling as though she was balancing on a knife's edge. "Of course, darling," she replied, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Just busy with all the volunteer work." As John nodded and turned his attention to his meal, Mary realized that her time was running out. She had found the evidence she needed, but now she faced the most dangerous part of her ordeal, finding a way to expose John's crimes without becoming his next victim. As December approached, Mary found herself in an increasingly precarious situation. The weight of her knowledge about John's crimes pressed heavily upon her, and she knew she needed to act soon. However, she was acutely aware that any misstep could alert John to her discoveries and put her life in immediate danger. Mary decided that her best course of action was to compile all the evidence she had gathered and present it to the authorities. She began meticulously organizing her findings, creating a detailed timeline of John's activities and their correlation with the disappearances. She made copies of her notes and the list of missing women, storing them in various secure locations outside their home. On December 3rd, Mary made a crucial breakthrough. While John was at work, she managed to pick the lock on his personal filing cabinet in the study, a skill she had secretly learned over the past few weeks. Inside, she found a collection of newspaper clippings about the missing women, along with detailed maps marking remote areas around Detroit. Most disturbingly, she discovered a small notebook containing what appeared to be a coded list of names and dates. Realizing the significance of this evidence, Mary quickly photographed everything using a small camera she had purchased for this purpose. She then carefully replaced all items exactly as she had found them, knowing that John's meticulous nature would notice even the slightest disturbance. The next day, under the pretense of Christmas shopping, Mary made her way to the local police station. She had decided to trust Officer Tom Reynolds with her suspicions and evidence. However, as she approached the station, she noticed John's car parked nearby. Panic surged through her as she realized he must have followed her or somehow anticipated her actions. Unable to risk entering the station, Mary hurriedly hid her folder of evidence in a nearby alleyway, marking the spot so she could retrieve it later. She then proceeded to actually do some shopping to maintain her cover story. That evening, the atmosphere in the Smith household was tense. John seemed unusually attentive, asking detailed questions about Mary's day and her shopping trip. Mary maintained her composure, but she could feel John's eyes studying her every move, searching for any sign of deception. The next morning, Mary woke to find John had already left for work, which was unusual for him. Taking advantage of his absence, she hurried to the alleyway to retrieve her hidden evidence. To her horror, she found the hiding spot empty. Her heart raced as she realized the implications. Either John or someone else had discovered and removed the folder. Returning home, Mary found the house eerily quiet. As she entered the kitchen, she was startled to find John sitting at the table, a grim expression on his face. In front of him lay the folder of evidence she had compiled. "Sit down, Mary," John said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I think it's time we had a talk." Mary's mind raced, searching for a way out of this dangerous situation. She knew that her next actions would determine not only her fate, but potentially those of any future victims as well. John began to speak, his tone a mixture of anger and what seemed like twisted pride. He confirmed Mary's worst fears, admitting to his involvement in the disappearances. He spoke of his actions as if they were a noble mission, claiming he was cleansing society of those he deemed unworthy. As John talked, Mary surreptitiously pressed the record button on a small tape recorder she had started carrying in her pocket. She knew this might be her only chance to gather direct evidence of John's confession. "You've been quite the detective, my dear," John said, a cold smile playing on his lips. "I must admit I underestimated you, but now we need to decide what happens next." Mary realized she was at a crossroads. She could either play along with John, pretending to understand or even support his actions, or she could confront him directly. Both options carried immense risks. Taking a deep breath, Mary chose to confront the truth head-on. "John," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "what you've done is unforgivable. These women had lives, families. You had no right to take that away from them." John's expression hardened. "I had every right," he snarled. "You couldn't possibly understand the importance of my work." As John became more agitated, Mary saw an opportunity. She knew that Officer Reynolds usually patrolled their street around this time, if she could just get John to incriminate himself loudly enough. "Tell me about them, John," Mary pressed, raising her voice slightly. "Tell me about Barbara Wilson, about all the others. I want to understand." John, caught up in his own twisted ideology, began to rant loudly about his victims, providing details that only the killer could know. Mary silently prayed that someone, anyone, would hear and call for help. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the front door. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith, this is Officer Reynolds. Is everything all right in there? We've had reports of a disturbance." John's face contorted with rage as he realized the trap he'd fallen into. He lunged towards Mary, but she was prepared. She quickly overturned the kitchen table, creating a barrier between them, and ran towards the front door. What followed was a chaotic scene. Officer Reynolds, hearing the commotion, broke down the door. John, realizing he was cornered, attempted to flee through the back of the house but was quickly apprehended by additional officers who had arrived as backup. As John was handcuffed and led away, the full weight of the situation crashed down on Mary. Her nightmare was over, but the road ahead, dealing with the aftermath of John's crimes and her own trauma, would be long and difficult. In the days that followed, Mary's evidence proved crucial in building a case against John. Her meticulous notes, combined with the recorded confession and the physical evidence from the basement, provided law enforcement with a comprehensive picture of John's crimes. The community of Oakwood Heights, once idyllic on the surface, was left to grapple with the horror that had lurked in their midst. And Mary, the unassuming housewife who had unraveled a serial killer's web, faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life in the aftermath of unimaginable betrayal. In the weeks following John Smith's arrest, the quiet suburb of Oakwood Heights became the center of a media frenzy. Reporters from across the country descended upon the community, eager to uncover every detail about the unassuming engineer who had terrorized the area for months. Mary Smith found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. While many hailed her as a hero for her role in exposing John's crimes, she struggled with the attention and the constant reminders of her traumatic experience. She decided to temporarily move in with her sister in Cleveland to escape the media circus and to begin the process of healing. The legal proceedings against John moved swiftly. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, including Mary's meticulous documentation, physical evidence from the basement, and his own recorded confession, John's defense team advised him to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. In February 1954, John Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murders of 7 women. However, investigators suspected that the true number of his victims might be much higher. As the case unfolded, more details emerged about the extent of John's crimes. It was revealed that his killing spree had begun years earlier, predating his marriage to Mary. The seemingly idyllic life they had built together had been a carefully constructed facade, hiding a history of violence that spanned several states. The impact of the case reached far beyond Oakwood Heights. It sparked a national conversation about the false sense of security in America's rapidly expanding suburbs, and the hidden dangers that could lurk behind picket fences and manicured lawns. The case also led to changes in local law enforcement procedures, with increased emphasis on interdepartmental communication and more thorough background checks for new residents. For Mary, the aftermath of John's arrest was a period of intense personal struggle. She grappled with feelings of guilt for not recognizing John's true nature earlier. Even though logically she knew she couldn't have predicted his horrific actions, she sought therapy to help her process the trauma and to rebuild her sense of trust, which had been shattered by John's betrayal. In April 1954, Mary returned to Oakwood Heights to sell the house. The process was emotionally draining, as every corner of the home held memories of her life with John and the terrible secrets it had contained. Many of the neighbors, who had once been distant and suspicious, now reached out to offer support and apologies for their earlier behavior. During this time, Mary formed an unexpected bond with Barbara Wilson's sister Sarah. The two women found solace in shared understanding of their experiences. This connection would prove to be a turning point for Mary, inspiring her to channel her pain into something positive. By the summer of 1954, Mary had made the decision not to let John's actions define the rest of her life. She enrolled in courses at a local college, pursuing a degree in psychology with a focus on criminal behavior. Her goal was to help law enforcement better understand and potentially prevent similar crimes in the future. Mary also became an advocate for the families of missing persons, using her experience to push for improved communication between law enforcement agencies and more resources for solving cold cases. Her efforts contributed to the resolution of several long-standing missing persons cases, bringing closure to families who had been searching for answers for years. In 1956, Mary co-authored a book titled Behind Closed Doors: Unmasking Evil in Suburban America. The book detailed her experience living with and ultimately exposing a serial killer, while also exploring the broader societal factors that allowed such criminals to operate undetected. It became a bestseller and was credited with raising public awareness about domestic violence and the importance of community vigilance. As the years passed, Mary rebuilt her life. She never remarried, choosing instead to focus on her career and advocacy work. She became a respected consultant for law enforcement agencies across the country, lending her unique perspective to complex cases. The case of John Smith faded from national headlines, but its impact lingered. It served as a stark reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, even in the most seemingly perfect environments. For the residents of Oakwood Heights and similar communities across America, it was a wake-up call that shattered the illusion of suburban invulnerability. In 1970, nearly 2 decades after John's arrest, Mary received news that he had died in prison. The news brought a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a sense of final closure. In the aftermath, Mary decided to establish a foundation in memory of John's victims, dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence and families of missing persons. As she reflected on the twisted path her life had taken, Mary realized that while she couldn't change the past, she had found a way to create meaning from her tragedy. Her journey from unsuspecting housewife to criminal psychology expert and victims advocate was a testament to human resilience and the power of turning personal pain into societal progress. The story of John and Mary Smith became more than just a tale of a serial killer and the wife who exposed him. It evolved into a cautionary tale about the facades people construct, the secrets hidden behind closed doors, and the importance of community awareness and support. It served as a reminder that heroism can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that even in the darkest of circumstances, there is potential for growth, change, and ultimately, justice.